All right, well, I hope everybody enjoyed the lunch here. And now that we've got that out of the way, I'm looking forward to an afternoon full of discussions with all of you in a little bit smaller groups. So what we're going to do is we're going to break out here for a couple of work group meetings. And our envisionment of these working groups is that this is sort of a kickoff. And what we're hoping to accomplish is creating some smaller groups among us here that are interested in specific topics, whether it's policy, the workforce development pieces, or the technology and applications. I know for many of us, our interests are overlapping among many of those groups. So as we think about reconvening these working groups in the future, we'll make sure that we are not doing so in a sort of an overlapping or concurrent manner. But for today, in order to fit this to our program, we're going to have a session now until about 2 p.m. We'll be doing a steering group meeting in room 201. So that's the atrium space out just outside here. And then in this room, we'll be discussing autonomous technology operations and policy. So the way we're going to do these groups is we'll have a moderator for each. We'll give you all a few minutes to sort of choose which group you'd like to participate in. And then the moderators will introduce themselves and run through sort of a concept agenda, we'll call it. But keep in mind, these are kickoff groups. And we want to take this coalition and be able to get input from everybody that's in the room here in sort of an efficient manner, which is hard to do when we have a big group. So please be engaged in the conversations and keep in mind that this is the beginning. And we hope to make these even better as we continue to move forward as a coalition. I'm going to let Hayden make one quick announcement about the dinner part of our agenda this evening.
The Smart Dinner Coalition would like to announce we have secured a bus for transport up to the Harbor House. So if you signed up, I think we were unclear on if that was going to be a go, and it is. So if you signed up and are still on board, that's great. We do have 5 open seats. If anybody did not sign up and would like to jump in, and then I guess lastly, if you do not intend to attend any longer, find myself or Travis just so we can get a kind of a final head count. Leaving here at 5, we're open to leave vehicles here on campus. They'll be safe and just fine. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Hayden. All right, so let's sort of break up here into groups. So in this room, we'll be convening the technology operations and policy group. And out in the atrium, we'll be having a steering group meeting. And the steering group is oriented towards discussing sort of the sustainability and growth of Smart Ships Coalition. So folks that are interested in playing a role in keeping this group together and figuring out what we can accomplish together, that would be the appropriate group to join. And the technology, the policy and operations group is going to play off a lot of the things we heard discussions on this morning. So please take a few minutes to find your appropriate group and we'll get started.
Thanks.
All right. We can get started. I don't think I need a microphone. Did you do a head count? How many we got?
I did a rough head count. I think we're near 20.
Okay. So I'll introduce myself. Brett Burns, Assistant Vice President of Research Facilities and Federal Relations here at Michigan Tech. So part of my job with federal relations is the liaison from the federal government in Washington and congressional executive branches, and also work with some agencies as well. So it's great to see a lot of the federal representation here. My background is a little bit with industry relations as well. So again, great to see industry relations here. A little bit of academic with the PhD in policy in particular. So this session really, policy process and how things get done, a little bit how the sausage is made, which is kind of exciting. In theory, it's all nice and written down, but in practice, it's a lovely mess at times. But a lot of effort takes place to make things happen, and it's groups like this that just start making things happen and just progress where we need to go, where the policy environment needs to be at the different levels, from local to state, federal, and multinational. All areas are touched in that multi-level governance of hard questions, hard problems such as this. So that's a little bit of my introduction. Hayden.
Yeah, I'm Hayden Henderson. I'm a research engineer here at Michigan Tech. Also an alumni of undergrad and graduate school here in environmental engineering. However, I kind of quickly found my way into marine engineering space just by way of sort of interest in mechanical and electrical type things. and continue to pursue that because it was a challenge. And so some days I regret that, but most days it's all right. Yeah, so I'm also a United States Coast Guard Master Captain, 100-ton Great Lakes and Inland Near Coastal Navy. Spend time on all of the Great Lakes, deploying various forms of R&D level tech and otherwise. So yeah.
Thank you. So this is, I'll say the meat of the conversation, the whole conference is the working groups. You've heard a lot of amazing presentations. I'll say minimal Q&A because the presentation is so good. So there's just not a lot of time allocated for that Q&A. So this is where we can break up into small groups and talk about some of the problems, questions, goals, and ultimately work towards objectives that this group, the policy, won't call it committee, that has a connotation, but the subsection of Smart Cities Coalition of Interest want to achieve and have those outcomes and goals written down and then published out to the whole team, and potentially put some actions next to those objectives. And familiar with the Armed Services Group here, action item list, name, when's it going to get done, and what's it take, resources to get done. So we do have that part of that as well. It's really the purpose of this group. Part of the policy part too is to frame the kind of constructs of the policy. Heard a lot about sometimes there is no policy generated for unmanned vessels. Then I learned Canadian, so Transport Canada. Now, there is a small autonomous vessel policy, literally. I haven't looked at it yet, but and then there's various definitions. Captain Cost, what is it, equipment or a vessel? That's a good question. Some people have answered that. And what does that mean? Some groups, there are many different groups. I learned a lot of acronyms today, but we can break up and talk about what groups are doing what, and then what does really Smart Ships Coalition want to do with those groups engaged. So jumping in a little bit. Again, the goal is to brainstorm ideas, actions that the work group can then work on after this meeting. Identify, one anticipated outcome, identify industry member or high-level concerns regarding policy. Talked about them. So now it's talking subjects. What are those big concerns? And you can't tackle every concern, but what are some that we can start to narrow down, maybe be a part of the solution? Hey, you want to talk about some of the questions that might consider in this?
Sure, and I'll just maybe add and preface that this is what we've come up with, sort of as Michigan Tech, in terms of what we think the group might want to accomplish, but that is certainly open to discussion or input, or if the mark is off, happy to hear it. But yeah, kind of some basic questions that have already come up, but maybe things like what components from COLREGS may apply, what absolutely day one do not, non-starter applications of some of that policy stuff, definitions. And then I also think, while I hope that SSC can sort of continue to be maybe a premier in this realm of these early definitions, there are other groups, Norwegians, the UK has a great group that have done a lot of these kind of day one definitions, and we don't have to agree with them. And maybe this is a great place to talk about which ones we do and don't agree with in terms of defining autonomy, levels of autonomy, things like that. And then maybe even some more, there's been a few alludations to like an interim policy in terms of those of us operating platforms today. What can we do? Because we're really all trying to be good actors and get out ahead of this, right? None of us are ill-intentioned in this. And so maybe a discussion on what folks are sort of comfortable with deciding on is sort of this now and in today type policy, in addition to where we think it's going. So just a quick housekeeping thing. I'm going to try and do my best to take notes. We hope to sort of distill this into notes and combine with the other groups and get up to speed with what they had to say. So if we're exchanging back and forth ideas and things, if you could, it's a little childish, but just state your name and agency again, just so I can make sure that's sort of in the record and give some context after the fact.
I'll mention that this is being recorded as well for the after market folks who can't be here today. So there was a lot of folks despite the large attendance, who still wanted to be here, couldn't make it. So we are recording this session as well, those conversations, especially the report out part of it.
I think we kind of agreed to, thought it would behoove us to, those of us maybe that haven't been at the podium yet, to go around the room and introduce ourselves and just briefly touch on maybe why your organization sent here, where you kind of hope to slot in with the policy group, just real briefly, a minute or two each.
Great, we can start. You know, we've heard a lot from our first person.
Start or skip.
Yeah, I don't think I need to go anymore.
There you go.
I don't know what I'm here, but yeah, Frank, go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Frank Strong. I work for Boston House. We do a lot of it in our office. Specifically, my job is I'm the chief of the systems engineering division. So we work on the regulatory development for clients. Good afternoon, everybody. Tyler Carlsgard. I work at Sector Sault Ste. Marie, chief of inspections there. So for commercial vessels and maritime facilities. So heading to school after this tour, and so it's kind of helpful for me to see where the service is moving, where industry is moving, and hopefully fine tune my academic focus.
Hi, I'm Ashraf Salim, Assistant Professor in the Applied Computing Department here in Michigan. We are interested in technology development, autonomous sensors, different integration of sensors, algorithms in the autonomous systems in general. So why I'm here, I know that policies should somehow affect the hardware, software code design of autonomous systems. And we need to understand the policies in order, and I'm sure this will be reflected on the algorithm design and all that stuff. And I have a big question. Do we need, for research community, do we need to have an open source autonomous platform just for research communities to try different integration techniques for algorithms and how this will comply with the policies of autonomous systems?
Hello, I'm Ali Awad. I'm a graduate student at Harvard under Professor Ashraf, and we're trying to research the autonomy and the model of law.
With Andrew with the Great Lakes COE in the Sioux. Not a ton on the policy side. I'd like to see where it goes. We're within the Coast Guard with tasked with freshwater oil research, both recovery and sensing. So see where we can go with some of this autonomous vehicles in that platform. Mostly why we're.
I'm Allie Gates. I'm at Ann Arbor working at the Great Lakes Center of Expertise, and I'm in the NOAA Valero building. So I'm also working on freshwater and oil spill research.
Good afternoon, Maria Collette. I'm the officer in charge here at local to the station in Dollar Bay. I'm really just interested in industry impact and then where the innovation is going and how that'll impact the cost work for me and for others.
Chris Burns, I'm with Mackinac Economic Development for Mackinac Island, Mackinac Bridge, and the Line 512. All those fun things are. And I'm interested in ferry boat operations initially, and we're doing some great work here with Michigan Tech. But interested in these rules because, of course, we're moving a lot of people, and I assume that the rules might be a little different than moving people on board. But we are very interested in moving that way because workforce issues are very critical to us. And so the more autonomy we can have in those summer operations should transition people for full-time, better paid, fully engaged careers. As opposed to just 5 months catching lines on ferry boat.
So Shankar from FinCat here, Washington, DC. We have a couple of projects on this platform, unmanned vessels, and I'm very keen to understand if we can go into the problem areas and so on and so forth. Thank you.
That bridge, y'all heard me before, so I'm not going to consume any more oxygen than that.
Yeah, Anthony Beaucage with Bedford, Canada. I think Howard did a great introduction of what we're doing here in Canada. I think just looking at a broad scope of knowledge, trying to develop and foster this innovation, especially in Canada, but everywhere else as well, and to use that with the knowledge we're gathering through policy development.
You heard me earlier, but Eric Calder with Interlake Maritime Services, owner operator of bulk ships and other types of vessels on the Great Lakes. I think we're interested both personally from becoming an end user, eventually of autonomous technology on vessels to supplement our crew, both in safety and operations, and probably some efficiency at the end of the day too. But also working with regulators and developing some of these regulations. We've had some success in the past. We worked at converting vessels to LNG, where we worked closely with MSC in 2013 to kind of implement some, develop some of those regulations for Great Lakes, and then I'm not going to question, but we very much like being an active part versus having to describe something and then us have to deal with it. It's to successful part that way, rather than collaborating program.
Jason Summers, ARIA, we're a R&D firm that largely works in sensing primarily with Navy, and interested in this question around policy. Senator Navy is kind of out ahead of the commercial. There's a lot of questions now about common platform, common architectures, and that's really interesting.
Hi, I'm Jordan Bay, an assistant professor in mechanical engineering and applied computing tech. And I work on the operational strategy for multi-hectare use autonomous vehicles. So operation of these autonomous vessels and also the underwater vehicle will be my point of interest out here.
Hi, everyone. John Winters. I'm a research scientist with the Research Center here at Tech. Principal investigator for our Great Lakes Fleet program, and also some other environmental monitoring systems that were developed lakes, so that environmental sensing can interact with the economy.
I'm a Pearson professor of mechanical engineering. I'm interested in climate change and renewable energy transitions. So why I'm here is because these changes are multi-sector, right? So the marine sector is adopting what electrification means for the power sector and kind of what those engineering and infrastructure changes might be for projects working with this on the electrification project.
Simon Wheel with the Michigan Office of Great Lakes. We heard my supervisor speak this morning. We're here to obviously as the funder of the Smart Ship Coalition, but also we want to make Michigan a leader on this technology in the marine environment, but also in this group interested in how we can use existing Great Lakes binational organizations to advance policy that are maybe and in the US. I think that's then also using our nonprofit partners to generate awareness. They have a lot to say and needs to be out of different policies and regulations.
I'm Jeff Ratcliffe, I'm the executive director of the United Alliance. Technologies and autonomous vessels is moving here and around the world, and it's in my backyard. Stay on top of it and we as appropriate.
My name is Tom Kessler. I'm a member of the local community. I'm just a retired engineer, and I have found that over 4 years of retirement, you can only watch so many episodes of The View. Something like this sounds really interesting.
Jim Baker, Associate Vice President for Research Administration, responsibilities include really interested in what are the policy implications of our commercialization efforts, what are the startups that we're forming that to be mindful of as they pursue commercialization, and what barriers and what facilitators are there in the policy for achieving practical technology.
So last, Jeremy Worm, I'm the Associate Director of our Advanced Power Systems Research Center. which is another center here at Michigan Tech. Historically, our center has been very focused on propulsion systems and autonomous systems, but on land-based vehicles. So I'm here to look for ways to collaborate with folks working on marine assets and vessels and understand how we can support some of that work in propulsion systems and autonomous systems on water.
Great. Thank you for the introductions. That will help us divide out as well some interests. As Hayden mentioned, I want to throw out some more ideas of some of the concepts. So we're going to break into groups of 5, 4 groups
That'll
of
work
5
out.
roughly.
Yeah, 5 or 6, yep.
And we can hash out some of those ideas. You want to explain this, then I'll go over some more ideas.
Sure. In academic fashion, got a worksheet for you to fill out class today. So yeah, I guess I would encourage you to branch out from obviously your core group, or if you have other folks here that you obviously align with already, and let's get into some groups and sort of pick some actions, maybe, you know, a burning topic or question from one person in that group, and then together with your varying viewpoints, right, kind of identify what might be some actions that would come out of that. And then hopefully one person within that group can kind of report out back to all groups sort of together at the end of this session.
You guys probably done this many times,
Yeah.
different workshop styles. I will say the umbrella is goals, objectives, actions for Smart Ships Coalition. So it's literally answering the question a little bit next door is also, what is the Smart Ships Coalition today? What are we going to be tomorrow? What do we want to be? And this is the policy connotation of that. We already saw a lot of the gaps, you know, identifying the gaps. That's part of this as well. Identifying a gap, what's the potential goal? Where should smart ships play a role in that? A good question brought up by Sam. You mentioned the word lobbying. Oh, I'm actually the Michigan Tech University lobbyist. In a formal sense, I'm registered. Is that a role of smart? I'll argue everybody's a lobbyist. Some are just registered and some are not registered. So you're all advocating for something, whether it's sales, internally, externally. Is there a role of the smart ships to be a advocacy group, to investigate, talk to, prepare materials for U.S. committees, staffers? Michigan Senator Gary Peters is heavily involved with autonomy in general and the Coast Guard, and based on this committee leadership. I'm familiar with that world. Is that an interest of this group? And or another, are we an advisor? Should we be engaged with the council that you mentioned? That is an international council of marine autonomy, that get the name right. Is that a role of smart ships? So there's geographic interests as well that you have to put in play. Should smart ships be representing this group and growing membership abroad? Should we, or should we focus on the Great Lakes? Should we be a part of the conversations of the new efforts to build the marine autonomy corridor between Detroit and Windsor? That's a question. Should we be there? What does there really mean? I just found out some people that might be happening. Someone thought it wasn't happening. So a lot of dots to be connected. Should we be a connector? That's another question. Could be all the above as well. So these are just some thoughts that you might have in the back of your mind that we can get to ultimately actions to proceed on.
Yeah, and again, this was, you know, sort of our proposal on framework, but you're completely welcome to flip the sheet over to where it's blank and start from scratch. So, you know, categories of kind of things with differing timelines and metrics. And so maybe one approach might be identifying something that has a very short timeline and obvious metrics, and then try and think, you know, far down the road on something that might have a longer timeline and some more lofty metrics or unclear metrics.
So see, now's probably the time to say physically
yes,
break up the
try and rearrange ourselves if someone wants to.
We staying in?
Staying in this room.
Yeah, we can
We can
reorganize.
do 4 corners of the room. It's maybe best, and we're talking 5 to 6 people per group. I'd say the Coast Guard representation is probably the half the group. So if you guys can divide out amongst the 4 groups, and that representation. Also industry, if you can actually be on different groups, because that represents that part of that policy network than others as well. And then academia is, I'll say, the third group. Distribute yourselves roughly evenly, so each group will have a almost rough representation of government, industry, and academia. You guys can stay where you're at. The next phase is going to be reporting out of your guys' conclusions, objectives, actions, conversations, and we're going to go from there. So I'll get about 3 to 5 minutes, and then at the end we'll wrap up this whole session. Well, we're going to start on my far left. Spokesperson, and talk about what you guys talk about. Sure. Good afternoon.
Our group, when we looked at the project, it's such a big topic, so we thought it was the most useful to try to scope it down to something manageable, and that led us to our overall objective, which was create a framework to facilitate research and development utilizing autonomous technology. So we didn't want to automatically run into a roadblock by going too big. We run into that COLREGS or the manning kind of issue there. So we thought by scoping the project something more manageable, we have a path that we can go forward on. And then our actions that we built out off of our main objective was we wanted to create a boundary for an acceptable autonomous platform. So piggyback on how Kathleen earlier was talking about, is this equipment or is it a vessel? Kind of describe out a smallish platform that you can be able to utilize for research and development. That everybody's kind of accepting that this thing is not fitting into the vessel thing. It's more that equipment thing, and this is something we'll allow to operate. The next one was establish a process for the shared use of a waterway. So again, we don't want to necessarily comply with the COLREGS. So try to scope out some kind of process where you can describe out, like when we do the research and development, this is going to be the understood process where we communicate to the kind of local maritime community that this is happening over here, the best to avoid it. And then our final one was kind of a more broader overarching one. We want to facilitate engagement with more international partners and create some kind of common vernacular to enhance data sharing. So one of the big things, like all these different entities are doing a lot of data collection, there's maybe not a shared set of common terms and things like that. So create some kind of use of common terms so that when you compile all this data, it's easier to share it amongst them.
Excellent. Thank you. I don't think we're doing any questions back and forth to the groups.
Yeah, maybe, I think maybe what will work best is if we go through the 4 and then maybe I can kind of read out, just make sure that what I'm hearing you say is this, and then we can have a discussion.
Great. I will ask that each group could write your names on the back of your sheet, because then we'll have a little bit of traceability. We could ask follow-up questions to the group that created the concept of the documents as well. So before you turn to this, we'll go to the back corner.
We did the opposite. We went a little bit broader. You had a great point about the lobbyist efforts, getting in front of the appropriate audience for representation, education, and awareness. So our first actionable item is identifying the appropriate government agency, whether that is going to be the IMO, Coast Guard, COLREGS. Just in general, there needs to be some type of event where interested stakeholders get together and discuss what needs to be addressed, a timeframe aligned so that we can move forward with drafting. So then identifying appropriate stakeholders and key players, what we thought that would be good interest would be the transportation committee, key legislators that would actually be supporting or endorsing the law, and then more industry partners. I think that the most driving force for this effort would be the industry partners. They have a monetary stake in it and they can move forward if the policy supports them. And then, of course, drafting the legislature. I don't know why I stick on that word. The timeline for the first 2, Sam had a great point. It's yesterday. We really need to move forward and have those meetings, determine what needs to be identified and move forward. As far as drafting the legislature, unfortunately, that's going to be dependent on when the meetings can be held, what timelines are established during that period. And then lastly, for action, reducing friction points through education. So working with industry partners and unions to supply test data, obtain it if we don't already have it, and then introduce staffing models just to reduce the potential friction.
Great. Thank you. Right.
All right, well, I got recruited to do this. So we spent a lot of time talking about software development and how that would happen. So we ended up with a couple of just two real key points. First of all, we felt it's important to be able to have open source development of software and hardware as we're looking at developing these technologies, understanding that once it becomes time to commercialize it, to put it on board ships, each company and operator is going to have to decide for themselves within the regulations. But the second thing is about the regulations themselves, which, as we understand it, the Great Lakes does not actually have to follow IMO and international shipping regulations. So we encourage the Great Lakes organization between the U.S. and Canada to develop its own regulations. And not worry about changing the international regulations. If we don't fall under those rules, let's adopt our own, develop our own regulations for operations on the Great Lakes. We have the ability to do that, falling under those regulations that govern the rest of the world isn't necessarily sort of that corner.
Thank you. We'll jump to the front corner.
So we never took the back of the sheet style, follow the spreadsheet quite, but we did come up with 4 things. 2 are action items, 2 are more questions. So the first 2 are, can the SSC define what are the competencies for the workforce, who would be operating autonomous vessels, and how do we train people for those competencies? Then kind of the next one is sort of maybe a question or an opportunity. SSC could have a role in advocating for grant opportunities that would help development of autonomous technologies, not so much relying on private investments, hopefully speed up that development. But that's maybe a question. And then the last one is, does the SSC want to define itself for the Great Lakes region? Maybe making a decision about that would help the SSC decide if we are trying to address Great Lakes specific issues, if that would help the focus, or if it would be, going more broad, would be beneficial. So that's what we're going to fill any gaps, but those are the 4 things.
I'll let Aiden summarize.
Sure. I mean, I think there's just like some very interesting feedback loops even between groups, I guess. So the first group was, sort of maybe chose to limit that scope to something manageable. And then we had a group who decided that, that was also the case more from a policy standpoint, whereas the first group had that idea, but, I was hearing it maybe from a different angle in terms of a more R&D focus. So I think that's cool that, same idea, different angles. Let's see. Group in the back corner, some lobbying efforts and kind of identifying some timelines as immediate in thinking about gathering those transportation committees and those types of folks. Maybe even looking towards, I don't know if the transportation committee bit was on, how might we look at how we use civil airspace for other testing like that. Yeah, and then middle group, some touching on the technology development, and then also sort of again making the statement that the Great Lakes does not have to follow IMO, which I would bet there's some folks in the room that might want to weigh in on. Let's see. And then sort of a workforce component with the last group and the idea that the SSC could have an advocacy role, which I think was one of Brent's kind of primer questions. And so I don't know, I feel like as far as a random roll of the dice, that's a pretty good spread between groups and kind of a lot of organic thought. Does anyone have any sort of, I don't know, burning opposition for other groups or questions, clarifications? I have a few that I kind of thought of as we went. Sam?
Yeah, I'm intrigued by why you wanted to set up a set of rules on your own. Given that when you look at COLREGS and when you look at inland rules, they're essentially the same thing. They're different rules, but for the most part, 1 through 13 are all the same. Dredging and probably towing, you've got, the differences there.
We assume probably 80–90% of it's all going to be readopted anyway. All going to be the same anyway. Just thought like we didn't need to be limited rather than saying you need to change these international rules. Well, we just don't have to have them. Let's adopt Great Lakes rules. Yeah, 90% of which will probably be the same anyway.
So maybe the disconnect is you guys are just saying we don't need to wait for this. You're not saying screw them, for lack of a better term, just that we no longer need to wait. And maybe it is just a copy paste of a lot of it. Is that agreeable?
And perhaps I could just be a culprit here, because I think perhaps I hear, there's a little bit of steerage there. So absolutely, the Great Lakes folks are not tied to what the IMO rules are, but you absolutely are tied to whatever those domestic rules that we have are, and the COLREGS have been adopted into our Code of Federal Regulations in Chapter 33 of our CFRs. That said, I think what we're kind of talking about and what I'm definitely hearing people say is, how can the Great Lakes be used as perhaps a testing corridor? I heard somebody talk about a marine highway or marine corridor, smart ships corridor, by which you guys have a regulatory sandbox here that's kind of protected, whereby you could try some things, test some things, demonstrate use cases by which then you could say, hey, what are those, what are some of these policy questions that we need to ask? And how do we develop the testing here by which we can show it works? And that, I think, right, the idea of a regulatory sandbox here, the idea of smart corridors here, and that bilateral coordination with Canada, I think that's probably super exciting about this area, and you're not kind of trapped or inhibited about having to engage with salties coming across from other countries or some of those other challenges. So that part I think is really neat about this area. So if that helps at all.
I'm sure our folks from Sector 2 too are aware that there is a naval bombing test bed in northern Lake Huron, right? I mean, there's certainly precedent for zones where there is much higher risk than autonomous vehicle pilotage, and so that there is precedent, I suppose, for sort of creating an offshore zone like that even within the lakes.
I want to throw out the term, some may or may not heard, but a policy lab. So it's a formal term that is utilized for different policy areas in the policy, maybe a lab for it. That could be a space where, as an academic institution, the host of Smart Ships Building, we can bring in that type of element to maintain a policy focus in addition to the technology focus. So there could be some areas there to keep these conversations going, to have advocacy, to produce materials, publications surrounding the world of marine economy. Don't know if that exists already, if there's a policy lab focusing on that. That could be a space. So what are the gaps? What can be filled? What role can be done? So that could be another format, a formal process of this group a little more continuing with its efforts from a policy standpoint. Great. I know it's 1:46, or only a few minutes out of schedule. 2 o'clock.
I mean, I think there's a little bit left to chew on if folks are up for it, or if anybody else has anything else that they're tip of their tongue.
I'll ask the question. This is the first in-person workshop. We have another one scheduled for a different topic. We want to make sure we're meeting the goals of this group. Getting you here is first goal, mission accomplished. Second is having these conversations, meeting individuals, networking, again, forming those relationships so we can continue on with some of those objectives, actions, etc. So please give us feedback too if this worked, didn't work. I think the conversations were steady throughout, different, which were great. That's kind of the point too, so we can give you an assigned topic so you can talk about something you don't want to talk about. But any feedback on did it work, did it not work? Yes.
What happens now that we got all the inputs from here? So where does this go from here?
Turn over to Hayden. Answer that.
Yeah, it's a good question. Frank's going to come up with the common vernacular. And we'll report out next week. No, I think that we're starting with, we're still in a data collection phase, very much so. And so I'm sure we'll get together, as a sort of a facilitating body, we being Michigan Tech here at the GLRC, and rehash a lot of these things and just make sure that all of this is articulated and then, somewhat distilled and readily available to be built on, going forward, I think is what we can hope for, right? We've maybe framed the room or poured the foundation. Yeah.
And if I can add to that, as the funder of the Smart Chip Coalition, one of the things we'll be looking forward to is, based on the group that's out there right now, the steering group, is kind of like, what can the coalition become after we've gathered all this information from the different partners that are here today. So that's kind of we're in the infancy of it, and we're trying to see what kind of legs it grows.
Nice. After gathering information, publishing to the membership of the results of the 4 different working groups and committees, and how do we turn some of those actions into implementation with adding names to individuals, perhaps in this conference right now, who's going to take this task and this task as the group grows to what structure to implement some of the things that are coming out of these early meetings. I don't want to speak for Travis, so it's not me.
Likewise, yeah. And then maybe regardless of this workshop's sort of charge or this session, if you feel like there are people that are not at the table that should be, I think we're certainly all open to more members, and anything that's an obvious, sort of hole in who's speaking and may have opinions or valuable information on something. It's a general theme for us being here.
Great. We can end a little.
Sure.
It's getting a little stuffy.
Yep. Fair enough.
It's humid out today. It's not hot, it's humid.
Yeah, so looks like 10 minutes here. We'll be into kind of the next session. Excuse me, we'll be into a snack break in 2:01. So I can't quite tell. It looks like folks are still working quietly out there. So yeah, Chris.
Just a question. This is just we're applying for grant funding to do a pilot project to transition to both from diesel to electric. The grant requires that we have to take the diesel engines out and drill holes through them and throw them away, make sure they can never be used again.
Okay.
The regulations, however, say that if we put electric engines in this boat, we have to have a diesel engine on board as well as a backup in case the electric motors fail someday.
Yeah.
That makes us then ineligible for the grant. And so, and these are ferry boats that are never 4 miles from shore, right? It's a regulation, a marine regulation, I guess.
Yeah.
And so, stuff, regulations are affecting things today. I'm sure a lot of the projects Michigan Tech's trying to do today. I'm just curious, you guys that are doing research and development and stuff like that, like, how do you get around that stuff? Marine's new to me. Grant writing and getting funding is not, but this is new to me, and the regulations just overly burdensome.
Yeah, I'm sure others, my strategic quick answer would be that you need a diesel generator for other electrical payload, and not propulsion. But that's a sort of strategy, deciding if you want to try and skim that. I think Captain had something maybe.
Frank, I probably closer to this than I am, but some perspective on that.
Yeah, there's no such regulation that would require that.
So why keep telling me?
Grant.
I guess, so there are regulations in place that say that you have to file emergency source of power.
Yeah.
Doesn't necessarily mean it has to be. You just have to have
No,
that file.
So a diesel engine. Yeah.
But is that a state requirement or is that a federal requirement?
This is what all the boat builder people are telling me. So I don't, that's what they say. It needs a diesel engine in case the electric.
Yeah.
motors go.
Caterpillar telling that? I would offer that they should have to show you in regulation where that is, right? To Frank's point and what Hayden was saying, you have to have an alternate source of emergency power so that if you lost your main propulsions, that you would have a way to maintain those vital systems, right? And so there's nothing that defines what the prime mover has to be fueled by, to our knowledge. So if someone's telling you that, show me where it is in the black and
It
white.
can be
reg.
electrical, another electrical issue.
It could be, but it might have to be off of a different bus, so that if you lost, right, you know what I mean? Like if you lost your prime movers, for instance, it wouldn't take everything else out. You have to have some of that, call
So
it
we're
on.
a similar system, just it's a backup.
Yeah.
That be in CFR or?
There's basic requirements in subchapter J, which is our electrical section that talks about kind of backup for vital loads and vital system requirements. But you know, and then subchapter F, of course, is our machinery stuff, but it's very soft on what the fuel it has to do.
Probably some education for the builders.
Yeah, we'll put it on there, Frank.
You may want to talk to people at the Native and Mist Ferry in Niagara Falls. They're full electric passenger ferry, and they kind of work, I believe, with the Coast Guard to kind of develop a lot of the rules
Place you
around
want
it.
to back up.
Under a giant waterfall, yeah. Rapid down the river.
Generally, all those chapters for commercial vessels are built under the assumption that you have a boat or gas engine on board. In all those subchapters, there's an equivalency provision where you can provide equivalency to the Coast Guard of that your propulsion system to provide the same level of safety and reliability.
I gotta get our engineers to do more homework. Right? Okay. Very cool. Thank you, guys. Thank you for that.
It's a great leverage of this event, networking, and hopefully make some contacts that you can call for reference, so they can put you in touch if you're have questions as part of this too. It's the networking aspect.
Very cool. Thank you.
Great. All right. So.